Deep conversations with Ulrich Baer on big ideas and great books. Well, I'm really happy to welcome my colleague from New York University, Wendy Lee, today to this podcast. Welcome, Wendy, to Think About It.
Thank you, Uli.
I'm so excited to speak to you today. And before we talk about what we want to talk about with Jane Austen, which is your specialty, among other things, just want to remind our listeners to Think About It podcast. We have a lot of conversations on books and ideas. You can find it at Think About It on Instagram. I'm on Instagram, uli.baer. I'm also on Twitter, which is uli_NYC. And you can follow the podcast on YouTube and all the other podcast places. It makes a great difference if you follow and subscribe because it allows other people to find it. And I produce this for the reasons we'll discuss in this podcast, because I care about books. And I love talking to people who care about books, like Wendy. So, Wendy, you are professor of English at NYU, and you've published widely on Jane Austen, 19th century English literature, and your book, Failures of Feeling, Insensibility and the Novel, was published by Stanford University Press, where you look at this particular strange character of the insensible person in English fiction and philosophy. But before we get there, because this book is really an interesting kind of idea that insensibility or insensitivity is actually a way of being in the world. Can you just start us out by sort of your interest in Jane Austen, how that started? Because Austen is one of the authors, I think, who probably inspires more of a cult following than many others, right? People who love Austen really love Austen.
Yes, I'm thinking about them now a lot because I'm working on this book about Jane Austen and the end of life. And I'm thinking about these people that are called the Janeites. And so we were saying earlier, my dissertation advisor at Princeton was Claudia Johnson. And so Claudia Johnson and this woman at Harvard, Deidre Lynch, and others, but those two in particular, have uncovered so much of the history of the Janeites. And it's pretty miraculous how readers have gotten through war, political crises, mostly men, honestly, and mostly men of state. Winston Churchill, Kipling was the originator of the story called The Janeites. But it's not just that certain readers gravitate to her fiction, but they truly need her words to get them through cyclical crises in their lifetimes. And so that they just really are a phenomenon. And myself, was no coincidence for me, and I'm sure for many others, that on September 12th, 2001, you started to really reread every sentence.
Oh, really?
And then again in this COVID era, people were really, really rereading and needing to read Jane Austen. And I held a COVID tea time every week, every 2 weeks for my students to read together. And I think it's a need that people have, and she almost uniquely fulfills that need.
Yeah, almost uniquely. I mean, to turn to a text. So what do you think people get in this experience of reading her sentences?
My claim that I'm trying to test out is that it's a very compact oeuvre, and you have access not just to perfect language, but perfectly, that is to say, totally conceived worlds.
Yeah.
And a kind of supreme intelligence guiding and knowing those worlds. And so there's something about accessing that intelligence, that completeness through language. It is a divine experience. And it is both very much of their world, personalities, situations, all kinds of horrible, annoying, boring things and
Right.
people and encounters, every sort of key of emotion. But there's something that holds that whole experience. And so what you encounter is the thing that holds all of that experience, all of that consciousness, every possible event. And that kind of communion is what the Janeites are in it for.
If you stay with that, there's a kind of world created in Jane Austen's novels with all these people, complex people, some very annoying, some very charming who do very annoying things, who disappoint you. There's overcoming disappointment. And the books become greater, it seems, with every small event because the people become more nuanced or sort of deeper, or they reveal something we didn't know. When you're saying this intelligence holds this together, this intelligence of Austen also created it. So how do you think people relate to Austen as both allowing us into a world that is that has a certain coherence, but not, I would say coherence, but not comfort. It's a discomforting coherence, but there's something that things are connected. But she's also the creator of this.
Yes. Well, I'm trying out this other claim that Janeites are unique because they feel that in their practice of ritual rereading, it counts as their own practice of writing. It feels like they wrote it or they have written it. And so that her powers become their powers. And, for your question about what is the relationship to this kind of intelligence that could produce this world,
right.
It's a weird thing where it amplifies or extends or merges into their own kind of creative power.
Yeah.
And so if you're coming back to, Emma Woodhouse, handsome, clever, and rich, had lived nearly 21 years, whatever, without very little to distress or vex her. You know that opening better than you know what your foot looks like or what your child's face looks like. I mean, you know it so well. And you come back to it as a touchstone every year or during particular times. And it really feels like your sentence, your creation, your form.
So you hear this language as your own language.
Yes.
So that's really interesting. It sounds to me what you're saying, people using these books as if they're they allow for a ritual of returning to yourself in moments of crisis when it's so hard to find some grounding.
I think that's beautiful, Uli. Yeah.
But it's hard to return to yourself when it's not even sure what that self is, when you're undergoing what you're saying, people read it during war, during COVID, during really difficult situations. But they're encountering now not a self, but they're encountering the self that read Jane Austen. So this language.
I think that's exactly right. And I think that's true that just how you formulated it, that you are re-encountering when you've lost a grip on reality and who you are in that reality and what you've been, you get it back, yourself back. Through the stability and perfection and known form of that sentence, that scene. I think that's...
And you're describing these Janeites. This is a recurring process. So it's not that this is literature as healing, there's trauma, suffering, you read the book, you feel better. They say the book grounds you more deeply in yourself to go through the experience, right?
Yes.
It doesn't deny the experience or doesn't say, and this is actually, because this has haunted, I think, the reception of Austen, this is not escapism, right? Because you've discussed this actually in some of your critical review of the literature, that Austen for a while used to be sort of escapist fiction or not. You're saying it's quite the opposite.
Yes. And I did actually, I'll say that I'm holding in front of me Warbler Press's edition of Pride and Prejudice, edited and with an afterword by yourself.
Yes. With an essay by Virginia Woolf, so I'm in good company.
Essay. And I mean, I actually really liked in your afterword, your going ahead and saying, let's claim this. Go ahead, call it escapist fiction, because
Hmm.
it allows people to imagine their lives otherwise or in another key or another way. And, I think that's a more subtle claim to, like, what do people mean, um, escapist fiction? And I mean, so somebody who I've recently gotten to know is this woman named Carol J. Adams. She is mostly known as being a vegan feminist activist. She wrote this book called The Sexual Politics of Meat.
Right.
And I had been meaning to read her essay that came out in Critical Inquiry for many years since it came out, and it was called something like Towards a Philosophy of Caregiving. And it just interested me, this topic of caregiving, because I'm working on end-of-life stuff. And she describes taking care of elderly parents, and really it's actually journal entries, a lot of the piece, and so they're pretty brutal conversations about things happening to mom and dad, pacemakers. Suddenly, I think it's like maybe in the 8 pages in or something, Pride and Prejudice appears, and basically she starts to intersperse with all of these brutal caregiving decisions and routines. She's giving an account of her not just reading, but needing to read Pride and Prejudice.
Mm-hmm.
And so I emailed her, and I found out she's working on a book about Jane Austen and caregiving. And when I interviewed her, she truly needed to escape her reality, in fact, through Mr. Darcy.
Yeah.
But I think it's clear that the text allowed her, Jane Austen's world allowed her to re-enter her reality with more fortitude and more understanding and survive it. So that's sort of more of the...
That's what I was interested in, this idea of escapism, because I think it's a sort of very facile way to dismiss, I think, a lot more than certain things. It dismisses fantasy, it dismisses the play of the imagination, it dismisses the kind of freedom to actually enter into someone else's world. And in some ways, what you're saying for Carol Adams to enter into this world and spend time in that world because she has to be in her own world, I think then escapism is not you denying your own reality, but you're actually learning things in this other reality, or you're actually spending time in a deeper reality. So I always thought, why do we think escapism means simplification? What if it's actually deepening?
Yeah, and maybe it also goes to your first point about, is it a one-time thing? I read it and I toss it. And so I did escape. But when it's rereading, then it is more conducive to this other kind of re-entry. And as you said, this idea that at a time where I've lost my grip even on who I am, I mean, that's a question too about whatever people mean by escapism. How do I know that I knew this reality to begin with? How do I know the world that I'm in?
Right.
So to escape that world means that I've grasped it and can go. But if I don't understand what I'm living in, give me some other way of knowing a world to know this world.
Yeah, escapism is interesting. Escapism presumes there's reality, factual reality, material reality, and everything else is sort of either a luxury or an evasion. When you're saying it could actually be a capability to say you're gaining something, to say actually your first reality isn't quite really even true and real to you.
Exactly.
And escaping from it means you can make it more real. Like this woman, Carol Adams, coming back to the really harrowing routine of caregiving.
Yeah, and even stranger, why do you think that language is less real? Or that this perfectly realized world with knowable people through and through is less real? I mean, that's what interests me about late stage cognition or end of life consciousness. It's so porous. I know that if I'm a dying person, I know exactly what is painful or pleasurable to me. Instantly, I can tell you, ouch, or wonderful, so it is real to me.
Yeah.
Do I know that that thing is real in the world or exists for you? I don't care. I have no investment in the reality as such,
Right.
but I know it's real. And that's a very interesting time of consciousness. And then what the mind is relationship to languages, and for a Janeite or a dying Janeite to Austen's languages, that's really interesting to me. So I'm trying to think about those things now.
I was thinking of something slightly different, maybe. So I was very close to Victor Ehrlich, who wrote on Russian formalism. He was a critic at Yale. So through my family, I was very, very close to him. And so he was a big critic. And toward the end of his life, I was very fortunate. I got to spend a few summers with him when he was very old and then close to dying. And he couldn't sleep. He was an insomniac. He couldn't sleep. It was very difficult. And I said, what do you do when... He said, I have so many people in my head because I've read so many books. And then I said, what do you mean? He said, I think about a lot of the stories and the novels I read through my life. And he literally started reading Victor Hugo when he was 12 as a Polish boy in French. And he said, I said, they're not real to me, but they're actually in my mind and I can follow them. And I thought it was such an incredibly moving thing to hear that he didn't discuss with me, is this a character, is this fictional, is this made up, is this real? He said, these people are inhabiting me now, which allowed him in these moments of when he wasn't very mobile and he was really close to death. He said they were filling him with life. And I really thought it was remarkable to think, you spend a lifetime of reading and they're with you.
That's incredible.
Isn't that a kind of a nice...
It is.
And there's something what you said that these characters are, or these, and I don't even know what to call them in Pride and Prejudice. Are they characters? Are they people? You kind of don't want to call Elizabeth Bennett a character. It almost reduces her, I feel.
Yeah, I mean,
she's a person, right?
I'm curious. Yeah, how do you think about this? Like the status of don't talk about them as people. Like, how do you teach that?
I actually teach really in the wrong way. So I teach a lot of literature as moral dilemmas, and I make my students read stories. And I taught Zora Neale Hurston's story Sweat last week in an NYU summer course to all students. None of them are literature majors, all STEM field, business, sciences, economics. And then I asked them at the end of the story, they have to read, it's 10 pages, very dramatic story about a woman who's abused by her husband. I said, should she act at the end of the story or not when he's about to die? And I make all of them respond. And I treat it like a moral dilemma, not a court case. I said the law would decide in this way. What would morality say? What would you say to this person? It's totally wrong teaching. Like, this is not a real person. This is not a moral dilemma. This is a literary text. But the students are so engaged. And I think what they glimpse is this person is as real to them as another person they met this afternoon and talked to for 20 minutes. So I'm not so convinced this discussion, whether that's a character, a fictional character, a creation of language, or becomes real, is really so productive.
Yes.
But I'm curious how you think, because in some ways your book, Failures of Feeling, touches on that in a certain way, because like you're sort of trying to open up a space. How do we respond to characters in fiction who we judge as insensible? Or you have this whole kind of genealogy of them, the prude and Melville's Bartleby, who opts out of things. And you're saying they actually have a function in fiction. They shouldn't be dismissed.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it is interesting to me what we need the characters for, or what we need novels for, what we need them to do for us, and what they can't do for us, and how we act out through them, what is possible only through them. I am certainly interested in those questions, and I also don't have any rules about how to talk about characters. And yeah, I just have no rules. I mean, because Austen has been adapted so much as movies or podcasts, or
rewrites.
blogs,
there's so many rewrites and fan fiction, right?
So many. And students now, they will have experienced those first. And so I do try to get them to re-encounter Austen as language, and really difficult 18th century language, basically. And so I guess I truthfully, I don't watch a lot of the things myself. Only because I don't, like, I do love, have you ever seen the Laurence Olivier version of Pride and Prejudice?
Yeah, in the 30s or 40s
exactly.
or something? Yeah.
So that one I watched a lot when I was young. And it still does stick in my mind, like those actors.
Yeah.
And I just think, for me, I'm sure this is how it works. Film is so powerful that it's hard to just see language again. And so I almost have to not watch them.
So when you tell your students to look at it as language, do you want them to, first of all, realize that someone created this? This is a human creation.
Yes. So there is an analogy often used for thinking about Jane Austen with Mozart, that she's a kind of virtuoso of this medium. And it really is true. So at the start of every lecture, I teach a lecture course here at NYU that's just Jane Austen. And at the start of each lecture, I'll put music on, some kind of usually 18th century or classical composition. And the comparison, I think with Mozart, I'll play the Paris Symphony. I can't remember what I played, but, the idea that when she's a child, she's read and been exposed to through her home, which is a very literary home, her dad's library, these brothers, very theatrical. And, they're reading all the time, they're putting things on all the time. And that she's really absorbed the English language and the 18th century novel form, plays. She just knows what it can do. And so she can just spin things out and make it bend to her purpose. And in terms of, when you think about that, not just in terms of like words or sentences, but in terms of narrative structures, then things get more complex, and then you're at the level of the symphony or whatever. And she can do that so young. I mean, she dies, I think, 41, so she doesn't have much time for like a late style. But it's just perfection to the end. Yeah.
What you're describing sounds almost as if she's kind of a vessel, the way Mozart is a vessel for music, although you hear 5 notes and you know it's Mozart. You read a sentence and you know it's Austen. So when you explain this to your students, sort of say she has at her command all of English language. She does something very unusual with it that other people are not capable of or trying to do, in terms of narrative, style, the kind of economy of character, how in a short dialogue you get an entire picture of 2 people. That's why I love this exchange between Darcy and Mrs. Bennett in the beginning.
The country, said Mr. Darcy, can in general supply but a few subjects for such a study. In a country neighbourhood you move in a very confined and unvarying society. But people themselves alter so much that there is something new to be observed in them forever. Yes, indeed, cried Mrs. Bennett, offended by his manner of mentioning a country neighbourhood. I assure you, there is quite as much of that going on in the country as in town. Everybody was surprised, and Darcy, after looking at her for a moment, turned silently away. Mrs. Bennett, who fancied she had gained a complete victory over him, continued her triumph.
I love that you focused on that.
Correct. And in some ways, to be honest, I'll tell you also one thing. I read the book, I reread the book, and then I listened to the whole book as an audiobook, which I do quite a lot and during the pandemic. And the actress, Rosamund Pike, reads it, and it's so alive because she has every Mr. Collins. It cracks you up the way she impersonates all of them. But that exchange between Darcy and Mrs. Bennett, you learn so much about 2 people in the space of 4 sentences. So when you say to your students, Austen was able to do this, there's something greater than she is, that she can orchestrate and manipulate and put together in a way, and yet it's still hers. It's still Austen, right? It's still Jane Austen who writes this.
And it's weird because that it is through prose,
Yeah.
you know, like, so that is the thing. I mean, with teaching is you can show a clip and you see it one way and the scene moves one way. But when you open up weirdly with this very linear word after word after word, all the dimensions it opens up, like you said, in your mind, you see these two people, you see their dynamic, you see, you know, the slight, Mrs. Bennett. I mean, all that comes into play through this weird object that is marks in a row on a page. It is.
What do you think that is for us, that we are capable to be taken in by language, by a few marks on paper, to actually really be filled with like inner life or something like that, that we see these people in front of us. They are there, and they're quite real. That's why I said they're not character, they're real.
Well, since
and real, like what's real, you know?
Well, okay, since we're in conversation, I mean, tell me how you think about it as somebody who writes about photography.
Yeah, right.
You know, like what a photograph opens up.
I think photography allows you less participation in the creation of the impact it has. I'm actually very bad at screening out photographs' impact on me. I don't like to look at photographs of atrocities. They really impact me, and kind of I feel they're very like wounding and kind of shocking. Prose, I think, once you're in it, you are participating. So even if it's shocking or cruel or upsetting, it's almost as if you are not co-creating the scene, but because you're reading, you feel, okay, this is happening, this is horrible, but I'm following it along, which means it's not just done to me. There's a part when you're reading, I think you're participating in it. I think that's what language is, because we're inhabited by language. I think sight is a little bit different to me. You just see something horrible, you can't unsee it. When it's language, it fills you in a different way. I mean, this is very unphilosophical, so I think David Chalmers would be like, what are you talking about? But you know, what you're saying, when people go back and reread this.
Yeah. But I wonder, I mean, I think you're right. I mean, I would, you know, that the abstraction of language enables a kind of freedom that visual media doesn't permit.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder, I mean, in thinking of narrative language, like I often think about if you trace a trajectory through film, photography, film, through something like virtual reality,
Mm-hmm.
you know, how, I mean, I'm curious how you would think about it, like in like an Oculus or something like that, because the person feels free and like they're making the decisions,
right?
And it's this full immersion.
Yeah.
I mean, how would you compare that to?
I would think there's still something different. Imagine you're in a kind of VR situation or whatever. You see these things are happening, there's space around you, things are moving and everything. I think that's still different than language, because you are kind of sounding it out in your mind, right? When you're reading. And that sounding it out.
It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife.
I think a few things happen. It's you who's shaping this reality as much as the author and the text on the page. And by sounding it out, you're gaining something, because your own language is enriched. And I think we're all relatively inarticulate in a certain way. You know, it's not just schooling that we know more words, but Simone Weil says at some point, the cruelest thing is people who don't have the means of expression. And she has this figure, they stand before a magistrate, and he says, you're not articulate. And she says it is the cruelest sort of misrecognition of humanity, that not being able to articulate oneself is not a failure, but a lack of opportunity or something. So when we read Austen, we're also getting this language. When we're in a VR space, I don't think we're really getting the skills to create images as much.
Yes, or worlds.
So this language, you're saying it stays with people. It's not that they memorize it, but it kind of inhabits you. It rolls around in your head. It's sort of words that are there, phrases that are there. And I think that's a really important skill, because we'll all encounter people like Mr. Collins or Lydia or something like that. And they're annoying, or they're this or that, or Mrs. Bennett or whatever. They embarrass us, or they please us, or we want to please them. But we need to learn so many ways of doing that. And I think your book, Failures of Feeling, is so interesting. We need to learn to modulate our own emotions and feelings. And your book is kind of a defense of that, I thought, a little bit. Not a dismissal and saying, oh, Jane Austen, she's kind of dispassionate. You say, you need to live with a lot of people.
Yeah.
Let's say in your family.
Yes.
That's why I was really interested. I think there's 26 characters in Pride and Prejudice. That's it.
Yeah, it's a great opening.
That's like, and I thought during the pandemic, I think I saw 5 people for a year.
And to your thought experiment, you realized you only needed 5 people.
I mean, I would be really happy if 5 people like me. Like if 5 people really like me and I like them.
That's the thing.
If it's the 5 people like me and I don't really care about them, that doesn't matter. But I don't want a fan club. But if I have 5 friends who I like and they like me and they, they do what friends do, they respect you, they criticize you, all this, that's a lot.
Yeah.
So I was interested in this book, Pride and Prejudice, during the pandemic. It's 26 people and you're reading it and you cannot believe what will happen next. And you think, how could this be when there's only 26 people? It cannot be that many things happening. And of course, what Jane Austen says, 26 people, of which maybe 10 are main characters, is an infinite set of possibilities.
Yeah. Yeah. And because it ratchets down from there,
to
2. Yeah. I mean,
4.
If you think it's interesting how the numbers work out. I mean, I always think, so her last finished novel, Persuasion, and for me, that novel is so cynical because basically the number is really down to 2. You're only going to like one other person, and also only one other person is ever going to really know you. And frankly, that one other person, you might have invented them in your mind.
What do you mean?
Consciousness in that novel is so porous. I mean, it is this end of life thing. She's sick. But that what Captain Wentworth is and how Anne Elliot, the heroine of that novel, experiences him as so deep in memory, and he is almost like an abstraction. Sometimes, actually, my students are so funny on this because when we think about like Captain Wentworth versus Mr. Darcy, I mean, Mr. Darcy has these great speeches,
He's very dashing. He's rich, controls everything behind the scenes, takes no credit.
Yeah, say more, Lee, say more.
Kind of a jerk, but in reality, he did it to really protect the family. And you're so gratified when you realize you're kind of rooting for him, but you're also rooting for Elizabeth because he's such an asshole. The first time when he snubs her.
She is tolerable, but not handsome enough to tempt me.
And you kind of think like,
she's tolerable.
I actually want to have that fortitude when someone rejects me to think, oh, how funny that he doesn't think I'm so attractive. That scene is to me amazing. So she gets snubbed by him. He says he's not that. What does he say? He's not
tolerable, but not enough to tempt me.
I'm in no humour at present to give consequence to young ladies who are slighted by other men. You had better return to your partner and enjoy her smiles, for you are wasting your time with me.
But this is a woman in 1813 who's some rich, super eligible bachelor, kind of says not enough to tempt me. And she laughs, she says, as if I would care.
I also love that you focused on that. So
I'm just curious how you have that kind of, like, okay, this is my question about that character.
Yeah.
When I read that scene, I kind of think, I want to be this way.
Yeah.
Then I think, I admire her.
Yeah.
And then I think, is she for real, to quote my student? Like, or is she pretending? And I think a lot of what your work is about, like, is this a real emotion, or is she pretending to have this emotion in company?
You know what? It's when I read that in your afterword, okay, because, so this is the scene. I mean, Uli, you focus on basically Elizabeth Bennett using that experience of rejection,
Mm-hmm.
really cutting rejection.
Mhm.
Somebody says you're not pretty enough to dance with, and instantly turning it to a funny story that she can tell her friends, and really delighting in entertaining people with that story. I mean, it is fantastic. And so when I was reading it, the way that you describe it, I could even look at it, is you say, this is somebody who can be outside of the experience of being rejected. And so they can sort of decenter their own hurt feelings and respin it as, an amusing story or some kind of source of pleasure. What was a source of personal
Mhm.
pain? And actually, it was a question that I had about it. I think because I looked into, did this work on different thinking about emotions and
Mhm.
these early ways of like what an emotion is and how it was conceived of in earlier periods. And I thought, I wonder if instead of the model where she is personally wounded and has hurt feelings and then is able to put them aside,
Mhm.
there's a way in which just having this kind of comic sensibility prevents you from actually being wounded in the first place.
That's what I was interested in, whether she actually really isn't wounded. She just looks. And does that mean she's able, he sees her in a way as an object in our modern language. She's objectified. He says, not attractive enough to tempt me. That's objectifying a woman. You would think, okay, that's very sort of, we would read this in a certain way. And she's like so. And then she looks at herself and doesn't agree with this. And she doesn't get wounded because her sensibility is already something. Although this is a question for the book, like that. But the book is also about her giving up her pride and her prejudice, because both characters are kind of blind, not like they're failing to perceive certain things because they're stuck in certain ways of perception, right?
Mm-hmm.
So let's go back.
Yeah.
So do you think she is not wounded by this right away?
Well, in some ways, I think that it's what's like hot or
Yeah.
erotic. It is so sadomasochistic, like how they enjoy wounding each other, and so she'll use that snubbing to then in the next dance when Sir William Lucas is saying, "Oh, do you want to?" She's like, "No, I don't want it. Don't worry about it. I don't mind dancing with this guy." I mean, so, and then that of course attracts him. So it's this. I mean, the weird ideology, if there is one, is this idea that in, basically in the disavowal of powerlessness, of being wounded, of vulnerability, she wins it. That is what makes her so appealing.
That's what I thought. There's a kind of freedom in this character.
Yeah.
But Austen gives us a character who's not free from all these things, these slights, this pressure, the expectation. She has to get married. She will ruin her family if she doesn't accept one of those proposals, etc. So she's not really free, but there's freedom in her.
Yeah, I think I agree with that global reading that you have, that she is in the same set of circumstances as Charlotte Lucas, and yet just refuses that.
And what do you think about this one? So Charlotte Lucas gets married to Mr. Collins, who is just the most entertaining fellow.
Yeah.
And I really have Rosamund Pike's words in my mind.
Yeah.
And then Elizabeth says, why would anybody do this and reduce themselves to get married for security and money? And Charlotte says, what am I going to do?
Well, even better, Charlotte gives this insane theory of marriage, which echoes some early English feminist theories of marriage, where basically she says, she has this line, it's better just not to know like what your future partner is going to be like, because the definition of marriage is basically increasing alienation. And so no matter how compatible you are at the beginning, it's just better.
I think Oscar Wilde makes a great joke out of this later on. Like 80 years later, he says something like, you better not know anything about your spouse because it will only lead to disappointment or something. Like one of those little.
Is that in the play
It's-
that you
yeah,
published?
the funny,
Okay.
like, it's one of Oscar
That's
Wilde's.
exactly, yeah.
But so she says, you better not know because otherwise you'll be disappointed.
Yeah, it'll just hurt more.
Right.
Like,
Oh.
if you go in knowing...
But
you
meaning
know,
it's going to be tough anyways, right? It's not exactly a good idea.
Yeah, more than tough. Like, I mean, it really is like the definition of marriage. Yet you grow increasingly estranged from each other.
Yeah.
And she's already embedded that.
And what does Elizabeth Bennet, who do you mistake her for Jane Austen's voice in that book?
Oh, interesting. This is a very good question. This is always the question. Where is she hiding, Jane
Yeah.
Austen? I mean, Pride and Prejudice, in some ways, we're pretty far from Elizabeth's consciousness.
Mhm.
I mean, in terms of identifying the narrator with her consciousness.
Right.
But of course, she's so delightful and so free that everybody wants to be her.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I mean, I think in what we were talking about, in a kind of comic consciousness that can turn things to account and detach, I do think of that as Austen.
Mm-hmm,
I mean, is there deep feeling there? You know, of course. And in that way, she could be more aligned with Eleanor Dashwood in Sense and Sensibility, who has very strong control, but also strong feeling, and
but less likable in a certain way. A little bit.
Yeah. People really don't like
Don't
her.
like Eleanor Dashwood that much, no.
Yeah.
There's not a fan club for her, really.
Right, because they think she's super repressed and uptight.
Right.
And people think that of Jane Austen, who don't like her. Yeah.
Let's go to that for in a minute, what Jane Austen's reputation has been for 200 years, which has changed. But to stay, so Elizabeth said, Charlotte Lucas gives this kind of speech and says, marriage is going to be alienating in any case.
Yeah.
You might as well go into it for what you know very little that's going to happen.
Yeah.
Is Elizabeth Bennet a kind of a critique of marriage at this moment, or a kind of feminist cry for saying this is an idiotic system and women should have other choices?
I mean, I have to give a shout out to this essay by Ruth Perry called Sleeping with Mr. Collins. It's such a fantastic essay. And it basically, it's about like the invention of sexual disgust. And she makes this ingenious argument that sexual disgust is really not a thing. And early, and you can see it in Pride and Prejudice, because Charlotte Lucas can know exactly how stupid Mr. Collins is and have no problem sleeping with him. It's just an ingenious argument, in case listeners are interested. Ruth Perry.
I think people will. Who is this Ruth Perry sleeping with Mr. Collins? Yeah.
Sleeping with Mr. Collins.
Hard to imagine sleeping with Mr. Collins.
Exactly.
And she says this is
She says it's basically an invention, a cultural invention that happens later to control women. But it doesn't exist early on. And that kind of reading, I mean, whatever one thinks of the argument, for me, it is definitely more useful to think about Jane Austen from earlier as an 18th century writer, because there's so much more wildness and freedom going into her than to view her back from a Victorian perspective and going that way. So anyway, but that is that. Now for the critique of marriage part, I mean, it's weird. There's a line that I still puzzle with. Okay, so it's when her dad says, I mean, I think you quote it on the back of your book.
Is it if you marry Mr. Collins? Not this one. When if you marry him, I won't speak with you, and if you do marry him, and if you don't, your mother will.
Oh, I know. No, it's later, when it's at the end, basically towards the end of the novel, where he says, I thought you hated this guy. Of course, I said yes. I would never refuse this guy anything. He's too alpha male. But he says, but let me advise you to think better of it. I know your disposition. I know that you could be neither happy nor respectable unless you truly esteemed your husband. And then this is the line that my students and I always puzzle over. Unless you looked up to him as a superior. And then he goes on about, it sucks to be in an unequal marriage, not to be able to respect your partner in life, the sad story of his own marriage. And that's, of course, her model. But the weird line here is, unless you looked up to him as a superior. And so we always puzzle about that, like, for women and the problem of marriage. Like, is the ideal marriage then to actually look up to your husband. And my students say, no, that's not what he means. That you would always esteem the person that you're with, and they don't read the superior as, a kind of patriarchal
So not above you, but could it be superior just as a really great person? Could they read it like?
I hope so. I mean, like when I was rereading this recently, there were parts that make me cringe, that are really heterosexy. I know I'll rethink this later. I'll probably even regret saying it now, but there's something about Elizabeth Bennett bringing liveliness, to the relationship, and Darcy bringing judgment and experience and not, that kind of thing. And I just think, oh,
well, the
God.
Enlightenment has to have a counterpart.
I know,
there's rationality and there's emotion. So you
true.
feel it's too mapped onto gender in this way.
Or, I think another way of thinking about it is that it's so done up. Like he's so manly man, she's so girly girl, that it's truly,
But she's also so intelligent. When she reads the letter, Darcy's letter about about his Wickham. And then she dissects this letter in her mind.
Yeah.
And then she has to take some time off and be in a room and think about the letter. And then she has to think about her reaction to the letter. And this is what my late teacher Harold Bloom would say. This is an interiority that is unusual, which he finds only in Shakespeare otherwise. He says in Austen, it's a character who thinks about her own thinking, steps back and analyzes it. And that growth in one character is very unusual.
Yeah.
So she actually emerges in another place. And then a level of plot, of course, from the early rejection and the kind of bitter sort of like dismissal of Darcy to the end of the plot. This growth... So she is not bringing just emotion and lightness to this relationship. She is a really rational creature.
Yeah.
Like she says a rational creature.
Yes, that's right, to Mr. Collins.
Really important, right?
Yeah.
Treat me as a rational creature. And then basically says like, if you assume I can think, I certainly won't marry you.
Yeah.
Which is also really insulting to him. Like, basically, you're proposing to me, but just imagine I could think for myself, then I would certainly never marry you. Like he gets a pretty harsh rejection from her as well.
Yeah. It's a great point that you make that takes us, into the period and through persuasion with the speech that Anne Elliot makes about women and men. But in other words, if the historical circumstances of like a gentlewoman, let's sort of distressed gentry, you don't really go anywhere, like the men, Darcy here being like, they go to London, they do their grand tour, they go wherever. As a woman, you just stay exactly in the same spot. And so it's to your point in your afterword that where do you find the space to move or to change? And you find it in your mind. And
And do you think the book, so this is early 1810 or something like that, around this time. So then you have a whole history of novels and then, of course, films, etc., of these stories of a woman trying to find a husband. So I interviewed Susan Ostroff Weiser about Jane Eyre, and Charlotte Brontë didn't love Jane Austen. It's kind of interesting.
Yes.
She said, I'm clear why you love Jane Austen so much. And Jane Eyre is the other story, the great story of finding the sort of not so handsome but dashing man ultimately. But when you read Pride and Prejudice at the beginning of this 200 years, which is all the way to The Bachelor.
Yeah.
And to fantasy, like this kind of gendered fantasy.
Yeah. Yeah, what do I make of that?
Yeah, and like how do you teach, or maybe how do you even tell your students to say, we're reading a story of, 5 girls that need to marry a rich guy, otherwise they're going to be destitute.
Yeah.
They're like, wow, thanks for the opening premise here. That leaves a lot of options.
I mean, it is, I'm glad that you root me back into this reality where like, hey, Wendy, like, isn't that what the novels are about? I forget,
Really?
Yeah, because it's like, the way it's often described, it's like, it's like a sonnet has to be this many lines, this
Right.
and so you think that's the courtship plot. It's just the form she has to
Oh,
work
okay,
with.
right.
But you're reminding me like that form.
I think a
there's
lot of
real
people.
thing. Like,
But let's actually talk about that for a
Yeah.
moment, because in one of you review a couple of books, and we could talk about how Austen has been perceived
Mhm.
also. How she's either the kind of spinster, the poker, as Virginia Woolf calls her, kind of angular, a little bit difficult,
Yeah.
standoffish, or the nice, charming auntie. But that this plot, a lot of people attach themselves to the plot before anything else. I think they get the language as a kind of benefit.
Yeah.
But don't you think people read this in school and they really read Elizabeth and Darcy? No.
Well, I wonder. I mean, I think the movie versions, it's true they cathect onto Colin Firth in like a wet T-shirt for sure.
Yeah.
But then when they're hooked into the text,
Mm-hmm.
I think like one of the videos. Okay, so at the start of like the first day or the second lecture, I'll show 3 video clips, and one is this actually very Jane Eyre mashup. It's like a Brontified Pride and Prejudice, which is the Keira Knightley. It's like on
right.
the moors, it's like raining. There's this, I mean, that's very strange. It definitely is a dream that Pride and Prejudice is Jane Eyre, which as Charlotte Brontë, like rolling many times over in her grave at
Right.
that. And so that's one clip. And then the second is, some dancing piece from the 1995 Colin Firth situation. And then the third video I show is this thing that's called Jane Austen Fight Club. And it pretty much is what that description says. And so I asked them, like, okay, which is closer to the actual Jane Austen? And, there's a debate about it. For me, it's the Fight Club. Totally. That there are rules of engagement. You go into battle. You fight. And it's the thing. It's like, that's really what it is. And so I think they get, for the young ones, they're in a precarious situation. Every day is precarious. They have to go into some social situation, some freaking global capitalist bullshit nonsense, like this crazy internship competition. I mean, every day they are hustling and fighting, and they'd rather, it's a lot of emotions, a lot of psychic turmoil. Who are their friends? Who are their enemies? All this kind of crazy, strategic, competitive market economy bullshit. That's the marriage market. And and then where do you find the spaces for genuine emotion attachment? As you said, is very rare. It could be just with your sister.
And it's very hard to know whether it's genuine, because you don't know whether your emotions are really genuine then in this kind of marketplace, which is like Jane Austen all the way to reality TV, where there are rules, people thrown into a setting and say, oh, no, go make your match. You think this seems like a good match, ticks all the boxes. And then you think, you're going to convince yourself this is going to be my match because, this ticks all the boxes, right?
Yeah, I think, even for Pride and Prejudice, it's kind of far. I feel like it's 30 miles. But the goal is you actually want to just live close to your sister.
Right.
So if you can both make matches where your husbands are friends and you get to hang out with each other, because marriage, of course, is the great divider. And so if you win that game, it will estrange you for your life from the people that you know and love. And so how do you square this circle and the real relationship, as in Jane Austen's life, is with your sister. And so in Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice. Again, that one, there are only 6 novels here, but you can think they give it like the sisters in Mansfield Park. They hate each other. They're, one is in exile. And again, in Persuasion, that novel, it definitely, you end up with your soulmate, but it's so evanescent that you might as well be in a coma by yourself. So, it's true. It is about, there is a courtship plot, there is a marriage plot, but it is so much weirder than that. In each novel, I think each novel is a different experiment with that structure.
But what's interesting, what you're saying, how people today are in similar circumstances. We think we're so free from all these constraints. We think, oh, women can have jobs, they can have their own money, they can have their own legal status.
Yes, and it's weird too how the landscape of gender. I mean, even in this really fluid moment where you think feminism happened, what global capitalism has done to feminism is a nightmare. And so,
in what sense? How do you mean?
You still have stay-at-home mothers who are so educated to do good in the world, but just take New York City. Like, then they think it makes more financial sense for me not to work, for me to raise the kids. Wow. Let my hedge fund husband be the Mr. Darcy out in the world. I'm going to groom these offspring and kick ass in my PTA, but that's the circumscribed role I'm in,
right,
as an educated free woman living in 2021 in New York City. It's crazy.
That is actually the way you're describing it. That is like Jane Austen. That's crazy. That's like, actually, you're making me like, because I see people in front of me, and these calculations. It's better for me to stay home, raise the kids. Economically makes more sense while he's fighting the fight on Wall Street.
I mean, in a separate key, I also think, surprises me, I don't know how you think about it, Uli, people's still, the mystification and sentimentalization of marriage is kind of adorable and horrifying still.
Well, I asked Ted Olson, who litigated Windsor versus United States before the Supreme Court, which established marriage equality, which had been renamed from gay marriage, which didn't work socially, so they called it gay marriage equality. So Edie Windsor received an honorary doctorate at NYU, and Ted Olson, I think Theodore Olson, he was there. He was the attorney. And I said to him, Mr. Olson, it's such an amazing honor to meet you and all this, and it's great, there's now marriage equality, and now the pressure is on for all gay people to get married. And he said, I don't create, I create opportunities and options. It's up to you to fill them out. And it was such a great answer. He said, I don't care that there's all this pressure now. He said, now you're in the same rat race for the right husband or wife as all heterosexual people were. He said, that's freedom.
Yeah.
And in some ways, what you're saying, marriage still has this kind of, it is a kind of cardboard, yes, or like.
Yes, I think so. I mean, so it is, I mean, I learn a lot, reading Austen with other people. I learn a lot about where we are as a culture.
How they respond to different things in the books, you mean?
Yeah, and what they're attached to.
Yeah.
I mean, even the thing with marriage, it's such a funny thing when you think about it.
Yeah.
That's like, I want you to know somebody loves me. Somebody can live with me.
Like, so to show the ring and say,
it's just funny,
Yeah, you're right, actually, yeah.
And it doesn't, it's now, as you say, equal opportunity, gay, straight, whatever. But there's still a kind of, I need people to know.
That's interesting, to demonstrate to the world.
Yeah, yeah.
I also think the other thing is that the state is in the business of deciding these things is absurd in any case, I think.
Yeah, yeah.
Like who you live with, what you do at home. Why does the state get to decide? And the state gets to decide when you can end it too.
Yes.
Which is, people accept that. That marriage and divorce are legislated, which is kind of, you would think, what does the state have to do with this? What does it, Engels explain to us? It's about property, right? Like when Engels writes on marriage, I think in the 1880s or something, they say it's only to make sure that property gets passed down to the right kids.
Yes.
That's all
right back to the entail.
Yeah, the entail, exactly. Yeah. Is that word clear to your students? Entailed, the estate was entailed?
I mean, I'm revisiting, it's so complicated. The fact that it's all about, so tied to land and property. And also, I think the confusion, I mean, the entail is a complicated thing, but often with Pride and Prejudice, the confusion has to do with what class are they? Or,
right.
what, I don't understand what this tranche is. And that's a thing with Austen's world, maybe more to Americans, are like how we think about class, or whether we can talk about class, right, and how that maps onto these weird gradations of rank and gentility and landowning in these novels. It's a whole other kind of.
But I think it opens up
translation.
something for
Yeah.
American readers or today's readers that, there's aristocracy, gentility, these class things that we can't really figure out. But there's so many different things in America we can't really figure out.
Yeah, tell me how you would translate it for your
Well,
students. Yeah.
I would think, like, if they see The Bachelor, like ethnicity and race and religion are categories there.
Oh, I
Kind
don't
of
know.
kind of unspoken.
Tell me about
but-
The Bachelor, Uli.
Well,
How does it
the
work?
first African-American bachelor. That's a big deal. And then there's like social media blow-ups because one of the contestants maybe said something how maybe they would be comfortable dating a black guy.
Mm-hmm.
So suddenly you have categories in there that are all supposed to be transcended by love.
Yeah.
Like in Jane Austen, ultimately we think, well, Elizabeth should choose the man she loves, like her father says, not the man who has the money to save her from poverty. So in some ways, these categories that we use, race, ethnicity, background, it's not just money.
Yeah.
You can be super rich,
Yeah.
but you're the wrong religion.
Mm-hmm.
So, there's a rewriting, it's called Pride, American sort of teenager, and she falls in love with the boy next door. And I think I mentioned, I'm not sure.
Yeah, you do.
I mentioned it. Okay,
It's
so
like
look,
2018, like really recent.
and it's,
yeah.
I was just totally absorbed by this book because she's giving us a novel, a rewriting of Pride and Prejudice called Pride, where it's mapped onto, it's Ibi Zoboi,
Okay.
2018, falls in love with the boy who just moves in next door, who's Darcy. And he has a horrible grandmother who is Lady de Burgh, who really humiliates her. And it's a similar plot.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just about money. It's also about color, about ethnicity, about background, about immigrants. So it's mapped onto American reality today. When you would think, well, a girl can just date the guy she
Exactly.
likes. So she uses all these categories and makes them visible. The way we look maybe at Pride and Prejudice and try to puzzle through, like, wait,
Yeah.
what is their class status?
Yeah.
And you're thinking, in Pride, in this book here, Ibi Zoboj's book, what is their ethnic status? Some are not the same.
Yeah.
So I think what Pride and Prejudice can
Great.
do, it can open up these things, even for gender.
Mm-hmm.
Like, so you'd come with the perfect marriage partner. He happens to be a woman.
Yeah.
These different categories that we use today.
distinctions. Yeah. Yeah, I'll definitely read that.
It's
'Cause I was
it's
even
fun. It's a
thinking-
fun book, and it's
But it's hard. It's hard to like map it into, like, for me, it'll be very useful. I mean, I was even thinking of Lydia Bennett, this reread.
Yes.
Like what would the equivalent be of where my sister does something
right
so crazy that, and it has tarnished.
because she elopes with the soldier.
Yeah, I mean, basically, she has sex with him and is the kind of fault, but it will, be like a fallen woman thing.
Yeah,
and
yeah,
then
yeah.
Darcy patches
Right.
it up by making him get married. But like, say your relative did that today, it wouldn't then make everybody in the family take you off the, wouldn't taint your prospects for life, So it's like, what could your relative do, even if they were, their political things, like,
Mhm.
let's say they could, but it's like they could pretty much do anything. It wouldn't taint
Right,
your.
right.
And then I thought, there is something about sex that still maybe has a taint to it. So, and I was saying to this group, like, if you know my sister, you'll think this is really funny, because this is like just completely a crazy idea that so if my sister had a certain kind of politics or whatever,
Right.
not a big deal. But if I said, my sister is a sex worker or like a particular kind of pornography actress,
Right.
or like is Stormy Daniels' producer,
Right.
there is something still about that that's, has a kind of effect.
Because they think because you're in the same family, you think, what do I have to think about your character now?
Yeah.
Because that's what Jane Austen puts into play. Sort of, she says, Lydia's behavior, it's outrageous, but maybe he thinks, well, if she could do that, what if you're okay? I think maybe there's also that.
Yeah, and a friend of mine pointed this out to me that I didn't notice before. This line, it's like that the neighbors would get more mirth out of seeing Lydia come to town or come to the town. And so which means be a prostitute.
Oh my
So
God.
actually, it's so explicit here. And Jane Austen, I mean, it's a joke. It's basically like, you know, Schadenfreude, exponentialized. So it's
Yeah,
like,
right.
everybody's having so much fun thinking of Lydia as a
Yeah,
hoe bag.
yeah,
But
yeah.
if she were really a hoe bag, we're we're denying them that pleasure by
Oh,
having
right,
her
right.
married to Wickham. So, I mean, just the levels of darkness and reality.
Right.
And I actually, to come back to the thing, that's what students like. That's what, Janeites. I mean, somebody who really comes to grip with every undercurrent, every unappealing part of social behavior,
Mm-hmm.
and also offers a kind of transcendence.
Mm-hmm.
That's what Jane Austen gives you.
And you mean by transcendence?
Yeah, it's weird because you could be so in the reality of that world and really reckon with every ugly part of the world that you're in. And yet I think it is the form of it, the perfection of it,
Mm-hmm.
the intelligence of it, the detachment from it,
Mm-hmm.
that then opens up a kind of transcendence
Mm-hmm.
from the
Mm-hmm.
reality
Mm-hmm.
that lets you come back into it, survive it, get pleasures out of it, and be better in it, understand
Right,
it.
right. If you think of Jane Austen's reputation, I read your essay where you talk about sort of how her reputation sort of shifted. So her nephew published this memoir, which established her as kind of like hiding her writing and being a little bit of a spinster auntie and kind of benign, right, and writing her secret novels there. That shaped the image for quite a while. But you actually started us out by saying people like Churchill have taken Austen not as solace, not as escape, but kind of to understand where they are in the world during these major crises.
Yeah.
So what happens after this shift? And you say there's still another image of Austen still as kind of a crank or something misanthropic, cold person.
Yeah, so that the essay that is pivotal that really interested me was this essay called Regulated Hatred,
Mm-hmm.
by the social psychologist out of Cambridge, D.W. Harding, writing just at the outbreak of World War II.
Mm-hmm.
And he gives this lecture, and he basically says, if you thought Jane Austen people are reading her to escape reality, think again. And actually, his argument there is her world is not a delicate satire, escapist world.
Mm-hmm.
It's a hard ass world in which the dominant theme is,
Mm-hmm.
how do I manage my hatred? I live in a hateful world. There are these hateful people.
Mm-hmm.
How can I navigate and this environment and my own rational emotional response? How do I do it?
Hmm.
And so he read then Austen's texts and the practice of reading Austen as a kind of playbook for regulating, managing hatred.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And hatred, I mean, you could think the time that he's writing in England, hatred is just a fact. It is a fact of psychic and political reality and social reality. And from then on, at least in terms of criticism of Austen, I think you saw things before, but it really became impossible to characterize Austen as a delicate satirist,
Right,
dear Aunt
right.
Jane. It just stuck to her. Hatred just stuck to her.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. It's quite interesting, actually, that she sort of underwent this shift in reputation.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I wonder where she is now in the because she's so popular. So I don't know. What do you?
I think she's popular largely through the marriage plot.
Mm-hmm.
I think the plot drives some of it, but I think then people get that there's so much more. The things you've been describing, this kind of creating an entire world with so much complexity that includes negative or painful emotions, disappointments, displeasure, hatred, all these things. It's not benign in any way, and that you are participating in someone's world who I think allows you to co-create. Like a couple things you've said, oh, someone pointed this sentence out to me, or someone said this to me, and I'm thinking, you've read this book so many times, you would be surprised. That you can be surprised by a Jane Austen novel after having read it so many times. I think that depth is what generates this interest. It starts with the marriage plot, I think, a little bit, but I think then people realize there's so much.
Yes, there's an anecdote. It's a good one where somebody asked the analytic philosopher Gilbert Ryle, "Hey, Professor Ryle, do you ever read novels?" And he says, "All 6 every year."
Oh, that's funny.
And once like a philosopher or a certain intellectual or writer was a Janeite, you can really see it.
Really?
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah, so
That's amazing. All 6 every
year.
I think the only other person is probably Proust, who gets this sometimes.
Yeah, you have
I know some people, like I have a friend and he rereads Proust every other year, all of it.
Wow.
Yeah, so he actually teaches architecture at the Institute of Fine Arts here, Jean-Louis Cohen, and he's a major critic of modernist architecture, but he said every other year in the summer I read all of Proust.
Wow.
Which I think is also how you can be French. I think there's also that like
national culture.
Yeah, but there are very few authors who reward that kind of rereading, I think, in this way.
Well, that's interesting, the culture thing. I'm Korean American, and I think like my mom, I mean, we know Austen has this appeal, especially in India, especially in other, but how she travels across cultures, like I never think Austen isn't mine because I'm not English, and I'm not an Anglophile, so I don't care about Englishness when I read her.
Right.
But it's my language, that is my language. And so, but, I think other people do get those satisfactions from her.
I think she does this English thing for English people like Woolf does, but she's also not a national author.
Yeah.
I think, that's probably offensive to a lot of English people.
Yeah.
But I actually also think Kafka is not a national author. Kafka wrote in German, so I have some access to it because I grew up in Germany and I speak German, but it's not a German author. He also didn't live in Germany. He wasn't German by nationality and all this, but certain authors, I think, have something else in addition, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, just to throw gender on that, because she was a man's writer for a long time, and I do think where we are, because I get so few sort of cis men in my classes, and it seems like in Austen scholarship, it's very, she's not a womany subject, but in terms of popular interest, it does seem like she's thought of as, like straight men would not think to read her necessarily.
Although you think that Churchill and people, there's a certain tradition of men. I
know. So I kind of feel like I want to open her back up, to that. Here I credit my mentor, Claudia Johnson. I mean, her work is so interesting on Austen, but a lot of it really taps into Austen's project of remaking masculinity and really showing people what a good man is.
Yeah, right.
And that still holds. And, that fantasy is available to all of us. It does, and people gravitate to that, to be a good mensch, no matter what gender, what orientation you are.
And I'm going to ask you a very simple question, which is Jane Austen considered kind of or claimed in the feminist tradition, the way Mary Wollstonecraft and Mary Shelley is in a certain way? Like, I think there's a certain kind of attachment in, if you think of the Mad Woman in the Attic, kind of the big explosion of kind of really powerful feminist criticism. Like they look at Jane Eyre, it seems more than Jane Austen. I mean, Charlotte Brontë, right, than Jane Austen.
Yeah. You mean, like the whole Gilbert Goubart.
Yeah, but that's like a big, powerful strand of criticism now for 50 years, right?
It's true. Oh, I actually wanted to ask you the same question. That's interesting, the category and like what purchase it has today of women's writing or women's literature, or women, and then how Jane Austen fits into all of that. I think it's just totally open. The way that I understand her, I don't even know how I understand. I mean, D.A. Miller has this great little treatise called Jane Austen or The Secret of Style.
Right.
And it's a very beautiful and idiosyncratic piece of criticism. But basically, one claim is that she's beyond the imperiums of gender or person or, class. I mean, she is trans everything.
Right.
So that's one way. In the history of writing, my own work and thinking as a historian of the novel is to go back to these women in 17th century France who basically invent the language of the Romain. And there's a story that they create this insurrection that's called the Fronde. And so it's a kind of civil insurrection, really civil war. And they're in charge and they do not succeed. And so because of their failed political ambitions to revolutionize the state, they retreat into their homes. And what do they do in their homes? And it's funny in the discourse, in not just in their homes, but in the space called the ruelle, the space between the bed and the corridor, they create the novel, the language of the novel. And so
amazing.
I know. And so I kind of think about that scene, however unreal it is.
Yeah.
And freedom in language. And then, of course, they're the subject of all kinds of libertine, craziness, Molière being the height of that. But that kind of freedom of language in a circumstance that is so constricted in terms of real rights, there's something about that attaches to the phrase women's writing.
Yeah.
And, so in your Afterword, where you do a reading of this novel and Elizabeth Bennett as claiming freedom even when you are not free in your circumstances, that sticks to whatever women's writing,
But that's a beautiful example, these 17th century texts to claim freedom when a legal, political, social definition of freedom isn't available. And they say, we're going to redefine freedom from the inside, which is always the project
and
of every...
from within language.
Yeah, interesting.
And the form that they'll take, are these kind of romancy, love story, adventure stories, and also about women. So, yeah, I mean, for me, that's the kind of primal scene.
That's great. Yeah. That's really interesting. So we'll have another podcast on women and writing, not in this, but in this way, rather what you're saying, that within language, people can create whole new realities. And I actually think that I try to teach this to my students. The Arthur Gates, the artist, said in an interview I saw a couple of weeks ago, politics is downstream from culture. He said culture determines things. And I said, who also said that? Is Steve Bannon. Because if you shape the culture, you're going to shape politics, actually. And so I think what you're saying, sort of these women writing in this space after they failed politically, supposedly, they still keep on being active politically, but in a different way.
Yeah. Yes.
So this idea that you can be creative, claim yourself, claim a space within language, that's actually really creative political work versus just working with politics as it already exists, especially when you're not in that process.
Yeah, I mean, it comes back to before we started the podcast about the humanities and how how we engage. And, the humanities it's what really matters to people, call it culture, call it literature. It is what is truly the most meaningful, it's where you find meaning. And so, that politics would derive from that, of course, makes sense.
We're going to end on this note. So I want to thank you, Wendy. So to just remind our listeners, so Wendy Lee is Associate Professor of English at NYU. You run a couple reading groups. So with some luck, someone can become a member, I think,
for
of
sure.
these. So
yeah, definitely.
We'll put the links, if there's a link to... You did one on Clarissa, I believe, on Richardson.
Oh, yes. Well, I do them from time to time. Then they change. So
we'll put them in. People can get in touch with Wendy at NYU, and I really look forward to your next book, Jane Austen and the End of Life. So that sounds poignant.
Everybody buy their Warbler Press edition of Pride and Prejudice.
Thank you so much. That is very flattering because I am by no stretch of any imagination an Austen specialist. So for me, this is like Mount Everest to even dare to write about Pride and Prejudice. I'm very grateful that you like
Yeah, it's a nice
Afterword.
object. It's bigger also than most paperbacks, so it has a wonderful...
We designed it at Warbler
Yeah.
Press so people can actually read
Nice.
it, because I
Very
want to
good.
encourage people to read these books and not find it like on Bible paper and small print and you can't get through it.
So no matter how many editions you have, as you know, you can always use another edition of Pride and Prejudice.
One of the 6 novels. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Think about it. Deep conversations with Ulrich Baer on big ideas and great books.